3, 2, 1. Sorry, 3, 2, 1. This is a debate about how you perceive evil. This is a debate about how you choose to behave as a moral agent in this world and how you choose to engage with people who are perceived to be evil in this world and where you create more social change. But I want to get to a brief characterization of what the widespread belief in this debate looks like. I think this looks like most individuals believing in this meaning that there's a lot more individual and personalized description and instances of why people commit evil, smaller instances, everyday interactions, interpersonal relationships. This also means it is far more visceral and descriptive, as long as evil is not tied up in this idea of hateful ideology or hateful system, as in most evil that is committed, or a lot of evil that is committed, can also be done by ordinary people who engage in interpersonal relationships based on their own motivations, their own personality. I think this is a lot likely to be a lot more descriptive version of evil. Secondly, your social interactions and national interactions are formed around the fact that you don't have to be a big believer in a hateful, deep ideology specifically to be evil. There are many other instances where you ought to reflect on your actions, where you ought to believe that you ought to be a moral agent. But thirdly, I think academia and literature is far less focused on polarizing alternative systems of hateful ideology as hateful and dehumanizing, and more focused now on understanding why people act in these moral ways and how can we engage with these people in far more responsive ways rather than just polarizing them, alienating them, not engaging with them, which is something we see existing in the status quo. I think interpersonal focus is far greater. What are the two ideas I want to drop in this debate? The first characterization: if you're a person who's bad in this world, or even a person who has the potential to do bad, who's close to doing bad, I think you see yourself as far of a less of a moral agent, and your capacity to do evil in your everyday life increases. Why is this true? Number one, you now think of evil as big systems in their world, and you think of evil only in systems, not as evil that is made up by the choices you make in your everyday life as a moral agent. This becomes an approach where people ignore or do not reflect on all these small instances of bad they do in their everyday lives, because they believe that the bigger evil out there is just this hateful ether of capitalism, of patriarchy, of instances like misogyny, etc. There are big systems, there are big words that you ought to tackle. I think people do not reflect on the idea that over and over small instances of evil that can be committed contribute to the growing of these powerful structures. Every person now thinks that their contributions to evil cannot possibly be as great as long as they are not motivated by this evil structure or exist outside of it in their perception, right? The problem is every hateful sentiment structure that now exists in the world keeps growing when it gains voter bases or when it is not reflected on in our interpersonal lives. Why is this important? This is important because every moment you spend thinking, at least I'm not contributing to evil in this big systemic way, or at least I'm not contributing to evil because I'm not part of that hateful ideology, is when you externalize evil and you never consider the moral actions in your interpersonal relationships, the small choices you make, and the likelihood of social change. The second thing you do, and this is my second characterization, is that you portray evil to be too powerful because it's backed by a hateful ideology and a structure, like a really big structure you ought to resolve or you ought not to resolve, like capitalism. You become desensitized by evil. That's the first process. And you think you can't do anything about it because you now think that evil is too big to fail, or that changing evil is too big of an action. But the second thing you now think of is you view yourself as less of a capable moral agent within this structure, because you now think that you can never alone dismantle such big powerful structures that are diffused again in the moral vocabulary of the world. But secondly, I think you now take this action to justify the bad things you do by saying to yourself that at least I'm not the primary source of the biggest bad in the world, therefore I am less obliged to take action against small evils that exist or processes that exist. I can say at least I'm not doing any evil in my life, right? But the second thing I want to frame, if you're a good person, if you're a person who generally wants to do some good in the world, who generally does not want to use systems as an excuse to commit evil, I think you deserve the comfort of this belief existing in your life. I think the idea generally here is, for a lot of these people who believe in these hateful ideologies, they're not born with it, they're often socialized into it, as in systemic large-scale systems that control your thought, control your rationale, and control the bounds of your thinking. These systems systematically rely on proving to you, by the way, that all other systems and narratives are worth hating and not worthy of your moral consideration. So for instance, if you're born into a religion, it tells you that all other religions ought to be hated because they choose to believe in the wrong God and because this makes you morally superior. This is also necessary to allow people to believe in the banality of of evil, because there's a huge asymmetry of power in the status quo between individuals and systems. You are coerced if you're born into Islam, into believing these things, that Islam is truly the right religion by your family, by powerful media, by capitalists, and by structures. But other people who exist in the world also believe this. They believe that your ideology teaches you to be hateful. They understand, or they realize that Islam teaches you to hate women. That is how they perceive the widespread Islam. The problem here is that people now think that your ideology isn't worthy of engaging in at all. What does this look like? This looks like individuals not even talking to, let's say, far-right scholars or scholars that they have ideological differences in, because they believe that the right thing to do here is just to dehumanize them and never engage with these ideologies. You think of people as evil to their core, not people who can be changed. Polarized thinking right now relies on making these hateful ideologies be perceived as so hateful that you think these people deserve to be constantly hated and they are beyond redemption. And I think this idea of being beyond redemption is the tipping point of when you choose to not commit anything for social change and you just choose to dehumanize these people. The banality of evil is good practically because it gives you a pathway to social change. What is this pathway to social change? The banality of evil tells you that these people aren't evil to their core just because they believe this idea, but they are simply people who need to be talked to and pushed to reflect on their moral actions. As in, it is not impossible to change them, you just need to understand the ways in which you can get them to reflect on their moral actions. They need to be reminded educationally of their moral harms. They need to be taught how to reflect, which means you now stop perceiving them as evil to their core and unchangeable. You now perceive the path to change as less difficult or less abstract, because you now think it is now their capacity to be taught that they can reflect on their moral actions. This ideology is not the end-all be-all reason why they commit harm. I think we can teach them to recognize the instances where they hurt people and where they harm people. But finally, I think you now force these people to reflect on every action, every conversation they have, whether they hurt people or not. The frame of how these people perceive evil and themselves as moral agents now changes. Finally, I think it's just better for your interpersonal relationships. Why is this true? Because within your interpersonal relationships, very often you excuse harmful things you do to your partner as systemic thinking. I was taught in my childhood that the patriarchy is something that I'm socialized into, is why I commit evil to my partner, and this is something that is too difficult to change because it's too big in the world. I think this is the sort of thinking that you tackle. When you systemize it, you break it down, you take it into a moral vocabulary that can be applied and can be changed, and you move towards social change because people now believe they can change other people instead of alienating them. Very proud to propose.
I think the main crux of this debate is small acts of evil that we talk about every day. But I don't think even those qualify as evil to begin with. Because in general society, when we talk about evil, we talk about grand actions, like the Holocaust. We talk about the genocide in Gaza. We talk about bigger, larger scales of evil. We generally don't use evil for smaller actions that we incorporate in our daily life to begin with. We call them actions that are perhaps not morally good. We say they're bad actions. We don't qualify entire people as evil for doing something that perhaps a normal person we can do. The evil idea of evil and the concept of evil comes from things that represent the worst in humanity, not just general bad things about humanity that happen on an everyday scale. That's my first problem with that. Secondly, is this larger idea about how, firstly, they talk about how these are too big to even change to begin with, these institutions, etc. I'm not sure how they're changing it, other than this idea about, well, this is polarizing, you engage with these people. You know what you do on the other side of the house? Not only do you call these people still evil, but still the banality of evil. What else you do now is you tell them they're too stupid, they're infantile, you infantilize them, and you think they're not rational enough to even think about the decision. That makes them more defensive of their action. The same thing that you do with right-wing actors in the United States of America right now, where you tell them that right-wingers are idiots for believing what they want to believe. That just pushes them into their ideological bubbles far more, where they think that the left is against them for being idiots, for the left calls them constantly idiots for not understanding what they're doing, etc. to begin with. They want to prove to the world that we know what we're doing and we are right in what we're doing. You don't engage with them with like sort of empathy, etc. You engage with them by calling them irrational idiots. Couple of arguments in this debate. Firstly, on this idea about how the banality of evil in of itself is just a false concept. It's been a pretty long time since I read Eichmann in Jerusalem, but the problem I have with this is, firstly, it also just generally should have been Eichmann in Berlin or Nuremberg, not Jerusalem, because he never went to Jerusalem, but like, that's a separate idea. But secondly, I think Eichmann in Jerusalem is based on, Hannah Arendt's analysis is based on one person in one specific case of the Nuremberg trial. That is to say, that it is often, it is one that he could have acted in ways, she formed an entire theory on someone that acted in a specific way, where he wanted to probably defend himself, etc., about from actual potential trial. That is where the infamous, I was just following orders, etc., defense, etc., comes from. But secondly, I think often oftentimes this isn't a representation of Eichmann generally, to be truthful as well. One representation of him in the Nuremberg trial isn't representative of what he did in Germany, etc. during that time to begin with. But secondly, I also think that the vast majority of support that technically comes from the banality of evil comes from the Milgram experiments right now. Those Milgram experiments are things that we have regularly discredited. Firstly, based on the fact that these are small acts that we continue versus actually going out and killing people in a lot of instances. Like shocking people versus killing people in, like, Hitler's regime are two fundamentally different things. But secondly, I think the fun thing you learned from the Milgram experiments is pretty simple. That people didn't think of their actions as just following orders. They felt constantly conflicted about the orders that they had to follow. That the idea that they had to follow orders, they felt horrible inside of it. That proves one thing, that the evil, that they knew what they were doing is bad, that they just thought they had to follow this bad thing. But okay, let's not talk about facts, let's talk about logic for a bit then. Firstly, I think oftentimes we are not idiot human beings to begin with, and I think our decisions, etc., are things that we rationalize. It's called the cost-reward matrix. When we think about even the smallest decisions in our life, we're like, okay, there's something bad, something good about it. There's narratives that exist in society about how we should not commit larger acts of evil, etc., about killing people is bad, committing a genocide, etc., is bad. We just buy into the idea this is a good thing for us, not perhaps that this is a banal thing. So secondly, I think oftentimes this is far bigger for larger decisions in of itself, because you have to think about a large decision far more than you would think about a small, immediate, quick-term decision. But thirdly, I think you have external avenues telling you that hey, this decision is bad. So during the regime of Hitler, etc., or the current genocide, you have external factors, etc., telling you why this is a bad thing in of itself. So perhaps the United States of America isn't telling you, but you have the rest of the world telling you right now, well, Israel shouldn't commit genocide. There is constant feedback that you get from other people that this is a bad thing and that you should probably not be doing this to begin with. Then you are rational enough to make those decisions, etc. But the problem I then have with us is that we don't want the people to buy into false beliefs, etc., because we want them to be able to make rational decisions about their life, etc. The reason why we don't let people buy into false beliefs are twofold. Firstly, especially related to the banality of evil, for sure.
If you're a person who commits great evil, should you rather be told you did this because of this ideology, it's not your fault, or should you be forced to reflect on the moral consequences of your actions?
You should be forced to think that I committed evil because I had the decision and I chose to purposefully carry out evil, instead of constantly telling yourself, well, I was a mundane, thoughtless individual that was just following orders. You don't take it to scapegoat the responsibility off of yourself. You get to constantly have to remind yourself that I had the personal choice to decide whether I wanted to carry out those orders or not that I was thoughtless or not. But first thing then, generally, I think the idea of the banality of evil strips away strips away the humanity from a lot of victims of that evil, etc. to begin with. This is pretty simple. When you realize when you're told that your suffering, etc., had no point and you were just part of a larger machine that was carrying out evil against you, you feel constantly dehumanized. Because oftentimes, when you're told that a human committing acts of violence against you is not evil, but he was a thoughtless machine that had no use to getting something out of you, you feel even worse about it. Because there's no humanity attached to your suffering, there's no utility attached to your suffering. So you feel constantly worse. First, because you were, violated in some certain ways, but secondly, you were told that there is even no use to your violence to begin with. But secondly, I think it's harder to scapegoat. It's easy to scapegoat on this side of the house when you can tell individuals, etc., that yeah, you didn't have agency, you were just thoughtless individuals, you had to commit these crimes because you were following orders, etc. You weren't really truly evil, you were just in those situations that you had to do those things. That is my problem with them. You take away agency from a lot of people that commit evil, but you also take away humanity from a lot of individuals that are victims of that evil. But secondly, I also just want to talk about how the banality of evil makes evil out to be normal. And I think this is literally in the word. The banality of evil, where we start to think that this is something mundane, something human, and something important to our lives. That the evil in our society will continue to exist because it is a part of humans, and it will always be a part of humans. That we will always be victims of evil, that evil will constantly exist because it is banal, it is a part of our society, and there will always be evil. What this means is the entire idea about changing structure, etc., about desensitization, then also don't stand. Because you get desensitized to this idea when you're constantly told that humanity will always be going through evil, and you take less change. Because you're constantly used to the idea that there will always be evil, there will always be suffering, etc. And this is my other problem with them, etc. Because their ideas about changing systems, etc., doesn't make sense because I have no analysis for why they will end up changing things. Because all I have is you will have conversations with people that hold such deeply rooted beliefs about committing evil against you, and they will somehow change those beliefs. I'm not sure if you have the capacity to do such harm, why you will change with simple conversation. Why we don't have to call your ideology and the things you believe in horrible things for humanity as a whole, and why those aren't the things that we should care about. Because the simple conversation with someone that believes in the eradication of Palestinians, someone that believes in the eradication of Jews, etc., is not going to be changed by you trying to respect them or infantilizing them. They're going to be changed when you tell them that their ideology is bad and that their suffering that they're committing on the people is something they have a choice on to begin with. For all those reasons, opening comment.
3, 2, 1. The worst thing thing that can enforce evil is when you start justifying evil. Because that, if I cite opening opposition, I think that it was a rational decision to trigger warning hit a woman because patriarchy is an accepted truth that does not require thoughtlessness, but it is a thoughtful choice, is a world we despise. Because we don't think that in a world in which you can rationally justify your evil actions, you are likely to change yourself. And we unlock every benefit that we have established at opening government by just this one attack. Because at a point at which you are not malleable, you don't want to change yourself, is a point of utmost destruction. Because it takes away social change out of this debate. So for any team to argue social change, the incentive structure for social change is going to be the primary incentive. We are the only side that unlocks incentive structure. But I'm going to flip their idea here right now. They say that you will think that you did not have agency and you won't do anything about it. I think our counterfactual looks like that you will be realized that you did not have agency, you chose the wrong thing, now you have agency, choose the right thing and make amends for the harm that you have caused. What does the counterfactual look like in the opposition world and specifically at opening opposition? I am rationalizing every hatred ideology that exists. That means that I am rationalizing patriarchy, I am rationalizing nationalism, I am rationalizing the oppression that is caused as a consequence of religion and nationalism, etc., etc. At that point, how do you curtail damage on your side is a massive burden that you have taken within this debate that I don't think you can realistically argue within this particular debate. But on to the second characterization challenge that they want to bring within this debate, which also clarifies how they have failed to understand the nuance in our case. Their large idea is that this debate is only about large-scale evils. We only care about large-scale evil. Our characterization is very simple. At every point, if every human contributes through their small actions to evil, and they don't stop at the starting point, they are contributor to the larger evil, which we despise at our side. Because this is our comparative. Sir. We don't think that you can defeat large, I'll take you in a minute. We don't think that you can defeat large structures insofar as you give us a mechanism of how you want to dismantle them. You only can dismantle them when it is more visceral for you, when it is more accessible to you, all the mechanisms that Ali gives to you within this debate that are still unengaged. But on your side, how do you make people realize that this social change is likely something that you had to contend within this debate, which you haven't done within this debate? But I'll give you another analogy to further substantiate this idea. At a point at which it is okay for me to joke about women and patriarchy in a close-knitted friend circle, I am indirectly reinforcing patriarchy. But you know what? On your side, I don't feel bad about it. Why? Because I feel that I am not actively causing any harm, because there is a greater social structure that is causing an active harm. At that point, that unconscious realization of patriarchy is likely to translate into my actions when I get married or when there is a female interaction that is happening on a greater degree. I think at that particular point. Also, they try to just make this debate about mundanity. This debate is not only about mundanity. And also, within mundanity is a big impact. Anything that you say to an individual, if you say something that is traumatizing or that is triggering, we don't think that it is so small, even if it is mundane, is something that we would like to contend at opening government. We think in small interpersonal interaction. If I say something that has the potential to ruin someone's night because they are going to cry and feel bad about themselves, this is something that should matter in greater scheme of things, because these are the bases that lead to the fundamental differences or fundamental problems that opening opposition simply cannot cater to. I'll take closer.
Yeah, who is responsible for the perils of society according to you?
We simply don't contend with the idea of whose responsibility it is. We contend with the idea blaming whom will result in a greater social change is something that we want to contend at opening government. We don't care who did this or we don't care how it happened. We rather put blame on an individual rather than some superstructure that cannot be quantified is something that we want to argue within this particular case. But moving on to my positive engagement, positive contribution and evolution within this debate. First, we want to force people into calculating every single action that they want to do. It has multiple benefits. So first benefit, you are very calculated about what you do, you are very calculated about what you say, etc., etc. Why is that important? Because it is the chain of human action that result in greater consequences. It is not like something A happened and suddenly Z is likely to happen. It is A happening and then B happening and leading to a chain that leads to Z. I think it is always beneficial if you are able to stop that chain at any smaller point where the scale of impact is not that big, and here here is how our characterization of people wanting to do good becomes more important. But second and more important argument within this debate is victims' retribution. I think at a point at which you can blame superstructures and you can't hold them accountable because this is a burden they have to defend this in this debate, you can never retribute that particular victim, because when on our side you can blame an individual, you can always hold them accountable, because you can then blame that it was their thoughtfulness that resulted in the damage, not a systematic structure that will continue to oppress you, and it is going to be a cyclic oppression on your side of the house. I think this narrative is very comforting for a victim, that this was the only instance when it happened, compared to the idea that it is continuously going to happen because it is a product of a greater structure. And I think providing victims comfort as a consequence of evil should be weighed very highly within this debate, because they are the most vulnerable actor within this debate. But second and more important, another important idea within this particular debate, I think it is very important for you to be able to pinpoint root cause to bigger social problems, and we think that is only accessible when you can quantify those problems on our side, and this quantifiability is going to be our most important metric within this debate, because entire opposition bench has a burden to prove quantifiability on their side insofar as greater social structure exists. How do you pinpoint that there was a rationalized structure that enforced patriarchy? Who do I then go and hold accountable? A person who existed 2000 years ago, a person who existed 1500 years ago, etc., etc. At a point at which we make humans an active moral agent is going to be most meaningful thing within this debate, because we make sure that we give you a direct access to accountability and direct accessibility to accountability, which forces some meaningful change on our side. Last impact. The viscerality of experience and the ability to pinpoint is the most important thing, because abstractions will always create a room of exploitation. Abstraction will always create a room of scapegoating, etc., etc. At a point at which opening government is able to pinpoint moral agents, is able to pinpoint the incentive structures of moral agents, and is able to pinpoint how these bad agents become bad agents in the very first place, we take down the structures, but we do it more meaningfully. Give this debate to go.
So, there's a couple of things I want to talk to you about, but before that, what do generally be characterized as being evil? Government is lying to you. They have an assumption that little things lead to evil actions. I don't know what little things those are and what evil actions those look like. I think evil actions generally are what we as a society unilaterally consider to be extremely reprehensible. These are things such as rape, these are things such as mass murder. There are also things which we generally punish as crimes, etc. as well. They aren't basic immoral acts, they are things that are above that deserve unilateral actions against society, generally speaking as well. They don't actually tell you exactly what the incentive structures are as to why people commit these acts either. I will do so for you, which is why we'll end up doing this debate anyways. There are two things I want to talk to you about. Firstly, on victims, and secondly, on social change. Firstly, on victims, they tell you two things here. Firstly, that you did bad things before and now magically you will start doing good things. Why? Why will you start doing good things magically as well? Well, the entire premise is that you were thoughtless before. How exactly will you be thoughtful now? I am unsure of. I am unsure of what education this looks like, and magically you have the foresight now of thinking of every single action of what the moral harms are. I generally don't think people have the capacity, can teach that capacity to people generally either. Secondly, they are taking the burden on themselves that we will not be imposing accountability for any actions that have been committed. We think this is a thing that loses them this debate generally as well, because what they are saying is on their side of the house, victims don't matter, the crimes don't matter, but only matters is moving on. This is extremely reprehensible for that very same mother who has to hold her dead daughter in her hands and can't blame anyone because she has been told that the person who killed her doesn't matter, you have to forgive her as well, and he wasn't a human being, he was acting thoughtlessly, forgive him because he wasn't a human being either. We think that if you do not have any accountability for any criminal action, you cannot have society existing in any scenario either. You don't have justice, you don't have any criminal actions either, you don't have any concept of evil either. If you're completely okay with those actions being committed even once. The way we characterize evil to you is that these actions, regardless of how they were committed or how many times they were committed, are so inherently bad, society itself ought to combine and go against these actions. If you are saying that it is okay to do it once because you are thoughtless at one time, it is a harm that they cannot trade off, because the harm to society and innocent people around them is much greater than the then duty you owe to educate that person on random things generally as well. Secondly, they tell you that it's going to give catharsis to these people as well. It's going to to be thoughtlessness. Like that's the opposite. Because you're telling them that we don't care about the criminal because he wasn't acting rationally either, and you ought not care about the criminal either because he was operating correctly as well. On the flip, they don't engage with analysis you either. And not only do you dehumanize, do you rationalize the actions of that person, you also dehumanize the victim, generally speaking, as well. You say they are cannon fodder, they don't really matter because that is in our grand scheme of things of us educating the masses, generally speaking, as well. The problem with this is you are inherently dehumanizing people who have lost their lives. People who have been victims of massive great crimes against society generally as well. You tell them that they don't matter, their lives don't matter, their families don't matter, their experiences don't matter, their humanity doesn't matter, all because we want to educate that one random evil person who has already done crimes. We don't want to punish that person either. The second frame in this debate is on social change. It tells you two things here. Firstly, that people start reflecting on their thoughtlessness. I'm unsure as to what reflecting generally looks like. Because notice here, why generally speaking, people commit evil crimes in the first place. They do so because of three reasons. One, they experience things in their past that led to them adopting these behavioral patterns. This literally is a system that you ought to oppose rather than focusing on the individual. Secondly, they act generally speaking around their base, etc., and things like greed, through things like greed, or motivation that is consolidated through peer pressure, etc. This literally is also a system because your peers or whoever you're hanging out with is telling you to do these crimes, and focus on the benefits you'll get from them. Exactly. Thirdly, on ideology, etc. as well. You have radical ideologies that tell you to be hateful, generally speaking, as well. We think that these are all incentive structures of systems that actually tell you to do bad things. Which is why you ought to oppose these systems as well. And notice here, they never give you any mechanism as to how systems will change on their side of the house. Because systems will go unchanged. That means in the future, while you might at best case educate these people who already committed crimes, more and more people will still be coming and committing crimes generally again and again. That means you have a cycle of crimes on the side of the house with no way on how to end, because you don't deal with the root change. The problem is these ideologies, and we need to tell you how to fix that. Second thing to tell you here is that we will portray this evil, you are portraying evil as too powerful, and people generally won't look at the smaller things like being slightly patriarchal in their conversations. I have a number of problems with this. One, they never tell you exactly why you're portraying these ideologies to be so big and powerful in the first place. Because generally speaking, within society, we also have counter ideologies as well. The patriarchal movement has a counter of the feminist movement. The conservative movement has a counter of liberal movement as well. We generally think within societies, this is untrue. You never portray them to be too big and powerful. You portray them to be fighting sides. You can opt into either side if you want. Our mechanism for inciting change is telling people that the side you are on is the bad side. Please switch sides and be good guys with us. Third thing, I want to do this very quickly. Also, Osjah tells you that you will not blame yourself for being individually patriarchal. I think you will blame yourself on outside of the house, because you will blame yourself as accidentally being a part of that harmful ideology. We think people ought to think, when people are thinking of their little actions as well, they will think, what side am I aligning myself with? Am I accidentally being patriarchal? Am I accidentally being misogynistic or a bad person, generally speaking, as well? They won't look at the individual actions as generally as an individual human being, generally speaking, as well. But notice here, they never tell you exactly why people, generally speaking, will in fact be willing to listen to you either. You to say, we think the bar for evil is so high that the people who are actively committing these acts of evil are generally also self-absorbed and righteous within the actions they are committing, generally speaking, as well. You say they have crossed such a high threshold of being okay with whatever harm society is going to impose on them, they will never listen to you anyways. They never care what you have to tell them either. We simply think they will oppose anything they tell you. In fact, it will be much worse on their side because those people will be stubborn within themselves, generally speaking, as well. We think then, let's assume their very best case. In the counter that Muhammad Ayatollah fairly pushed onto us, that we will have things like minimizing and polarizing of ideologies, generally speaking, as well. Even in that instance, we at least incite a lot more societal change, because generally speaking, you will have diverging values, and you can then look at them on ideological perspectives, not the individual perspectives. You aren't attacking the person, generally speaking, then you're attacking the ideology they are attached to, which is why it is a lot easier for them to change sides and to perhaps look at other varying ideologies as well, if they don't feel like you're attacking them as a person, but rather simply attacking the beliefs that they grew up with around them. For the simple fact that we uphold accountability for the victims, the biggest stakeholders in this debate, I think we've very clearly won.
In the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, when you gave amnesty to horrible soldiers that said we were simply committing acts of We weren't committing acts of murder because it was simply an order we took, because it was a system that forced us to, because it is this nihilism that forces individuals to escape accountability. This accountability is the issue that side opposition never solved. We think inhumans can simply scapegoat their responsibility and push them on to systems and larger format of systems. We don't think that this is what opening opposition or even closing will probably deal with, right? Because the amount of nuance here is something they cannot fathom right now. The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is, what does this evil look like? Notice this is very important and exclusively important, because you do not perceive this as something you are capable to do. The fact that it is not something people around you are capable to do. The fact that your friend would never commit that sexual act that could violate the dignity of a woman, that could ruin her life. The fact that it's because of a larger social harm. The fact that you perceive yourself as somebody that can never commit that crime, right? And notice, right, because a lot of these people never buy into these narratives, right? First, I want to talk to you about ideological dilution, right? Notice on their side of the world, people will have echo chambers around them by saying things like, for instance, it's not us that's doing them. It is this horrible evil entity around us, right? That is so far away and distant from us, right? Notice that it is this narrative that exists within Pakistani societies as well. This kind of predeterminism that we are not in control of these entities, right? And we think, second, you can easily blame it on structural things. Notice how convenient opening opposition and closing opposition's cases for human beings that commit horrible acts. The fact that ideological dilution exists on their side of the world, right? Notice that means then people can use these acts to justify their violence, right? Notice they can say, because Donald Trump and right-wing narratives asked me to do this, I'm forced to do this, I'm coerced through this, I'm a part of this larger system, right? On that note, we think on their side of the world there is no incentive, right? They argue that there's ideological dilution in terms of the fact that you do not engage with these narratives and bubbles exist on our side of the world. We don't think that's true. When you actively believe in something, on their side, people don't believe in these narratives. On our side of the world, people start believing in these narratives and they hyper around these narratives. They feel emotively around those narratives. Means that they want to disprove the narrative against this, right? That is to say, if somebody is actively not believing in this, you want to hold them accountable, and that is why you have things like them going out and actively challenging these narratives. Even if they are polarized narratives, even if they are different narratives, there is more accountability and more reason to hold them accountable with each other, right? Notice that is why in the status quo, we revolt, we go and actively have protests, etc., right? We think at that point in time, on our side of the world, there's some form of change. Notice, opening opposition does not even have a counterfactual, right? We will simply tell people to not do this, right? We think that is something that actually can never benefit, right? Even if you hate me as much as you want to, you can never give opening opposition this debate because there is no analysis and no counterfactual there. At least I have to provide 1% of minimal change. That's something we at least do, right? Individual accountability is where we win this debate. Here is where I'm going to move on into my extension. No, I will not be taking up QI rights. Now, first thing, so important, and this is exclusively what closing government is going to do for you. Closing government is going to tell you who defines greater evil. We think here is where this debate is going to be won, because these benches never tell you who is the definition of evil. We think that the state perpetuates the narratives of evil and who defines those evils, right? We think the concept of greater evil is defined by a state because there is no set definition or right definition of what is evil or what is not evil, right? We think at that point in time, it is an arbitrary. The fact that in some societies, there are different moral metrics to do good and bad things. At that point in time, the state has an incentive to actively perpetuate narratives which are majoritarian in their nature, right? We think at that point in time, there are two harms of this. Number one, they can absolve themselves. Notice this means that institutional impunity exists. The fact that they are always doing something that is a justified act. The fact that if they're going to genocide people, that is perfectly fine because it's for a larger claim of national unity. We think at that point in time, the amount of definition control that the state has, the apparatus control that the state has is explicitly beneficial, right? We think that elites will never be held accountable on their side of the world. Also, they scapegoat the most random people. Take the example of ICTY, you scapegoated Radco in it, not the whole institution that has actively murdered and genocided people. So notice, yes, you do not have the institution themselves also being held accountable because you can institutionally have impunity on their side of the world, right? Notice that the accountability metrics on their side are so flexible by their nature, right? I think on those notes, the evil individuals at the top are not susceptible to that evil in the first place. This is what makes closing government win this debate, because even if I buy whatever their narrative or people can perceive this evil, the fact that the system itself is pit-edit against you and you cannot fight it is a problem. The second thing I want to talk to you about is accountability, right? Number one, right? Notice this is far more harmful for minorities in the status quo, because it is these smaller things that people justify to these minorities. The fact that you are mean to them, the fact that there are microaggressions, the fact that you are implicitly harmful towards them, which ruins their lives. This is larger narratives of polarization and right-wing narratives that actively ruin these lives of these individuals. Take the example of how gay people are isolated from these circles even when implicit aggressions exist, and people are like, that is not my fault because I am not a part of the system. It is horrible people, so I am not doing anything that is explicitly wrong. Right? Notice on their side of the world, the individual is also derivative of the system. So notice, you are a part of the system. So a lot of misogynistic things that for instance, if you ask your wife to stay at home because that's whatever, right? Notice at that point in time, that is because of the system, it's also contributing to the system being misogynistic as well, right? So notice that your actions lead to the system being validated. You are a part of the system and you justify the actions of that system. Notice at that point in time, accountability is far less because you do not hold your part of the system. You think you are better than the system, you cannot be held accountable. People on their side of the world are far more nihilistic because they think that structure across them do not hold them accountable. The last thing I just want to talk about is how a lot of people are complicit within the system. Notice that you as an individual think that you are doing nothing wrong because it's not my actions. I'm an ordinary individual. But when I as an individual are a worker that is involved in, for instance, complicit acts, the fact that I dug a manhole, or the fact that I was not doing my job properly, means that I am complicit in the oppression of these individuals, right? Notice that when you are complicit in the oppression of these people, you don't hold yourself accountable. And notice, this also leads to things like, for instance, political apathy and the lack of belief in institutions, and the fact that even if I buy their claims, there is institutional problems. Notice that on their side of the world, people feel that this is just how the system exists. There's no delta of social change. You can never achieve this social change on opening opposition. Why do we win this debate? Because we give you exclusive analysis on why, even if the intentions, even if all the benefits materialize, why people are still never likely to change. Accountability comes from within. Closing argument.
Three things at the top of the speech. First, I want to apologize to the judging panel. Second, I want to apologize to everyone watching the match. And thirdly, I want to apologize most proximately to opening opposition, because what is the intellectual gymnastics that Gov is doing in this debate? What is the concept of banality of evil? When Adolf Eichmann follows orders, Hannah Arendt says that the Eichmann is not at fault, that the Nazi regime is at fault because Eichmann was just following orders. So atrocities are framed as systemic failures as opposed to individual personal immoral choices at government bench. Why? Because you cannot blame people at government bench. Why? Because even though people want someone to blame, but if people are random, thoughtless and ordinary when they commit evil acts, then you cannot blame people. So you cannot blame Asim Munir for the atrocities in Pakistan because the evils that Asim Munir is doing are random, thoughtless and ordinary. So because evil is not a result of moral or individual moral choices, you blame structures. So you blame the patriarchy on their side. You blame capitalism on their side. All of this stuff, you blame stuff like human nature on their side. These are all of the things you blame on their side of the house. So opening government is arguing the wrong motion and is a clear fourth in this debate. Closing government sees opening government arguing the wrong case. So closing government decides, why don't we also argue the wrong case? So closing government's case on the TRC, I was just following orders, happens on their side. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all of that is their case. Blaming structures happens on their side. Individual accountability doesn't happen on their side because the goal is to change the structure. I urge GovWhip to make a case here because that's the only way CG can pull this off. I don't think they're going to though. I think it's very clear off bench. But I think that's the first extension of closing opposition. We are the only team to make the comparative clear. Opening opposition knows they are arguing the right motion, but they cannot express it to frame GovBench completely out of this debate. Also, GovBench is just proving our case, so even if I sat down right now, you'd be forced to give us the debate. Two extensions. Opening opposition does good case work, but they don't prove a lot of links within that case work. So the two vertical extensions we have are first on individual moral responsibility, second how this distorts how we interact with systemic accountability. You know why not?
The recognition of thoughtlessness is not forgiveness in our case. These people are forced to reflect. They are also punished on our side if they commit moral atrocity. The point simply is they are reflecting.
Okay, so they are punished for being thoughtless, yeah, but you still say that they aren't at fault. How can you be at fault if it was a thoughtless action? And I'll talk about this more in my extension as well, so you understand this more. Okay, firstly, how do people see see themselves. People don't like to think that they are villains. Already they want to feel good about themselves. Why? Because accountability is naturally something that's different. Admitting you're wrong, growing from it, all requires breaking yourself apart. There's a natural bias to not see yourself as a villain. So people already believe that I think that I'm just doing my job, or I didn't mean harm. I think that people already naturally believe about themselves.
Yes.
In this particular context, why is the problem? The banality of evil confirms this self-image. Because what the banality of evil says is that actions are psychologically inevitable. Why? Because they were caused by the system. Because people are just cogs in the wheel, because people don't have influence over it. That is why they are thoughtless actions, they are random actions, because the person does not have influence over them. So you don't think that your actions are moral choices, but external or random events. This is the link that opening opposition needed to prove on why you actually think your actions are random, or why you don't act upon them or don't take accountability like government says. So we are the first team to do this. I think then people do worse actions. Our characterization of evil, another extension, is that it occurs at the moment of compliance. So think about, for example, a bureaucrat signing a form that legitimizes a bad policy. Think about, for example, how Eichmann followed orders. Think about staying silent at the cost of a rape victim. All of these things, at those critical moments, you do those kinds of things because you don't think you have individual choice within them. And this is going to make the comparative really clear. We think our instinct in those moments, not right now, in those moments on our side of the house, is you have alarm bells in your head. Sit down, Osjah. I think you on our side think, stop, this is wrong. You're signing a form that's legitimizing the deaths of people. So you stop yourself. Look, on our side of the house, we don't think we made a rational decision. If a person is evil, you don't say Hitler was rational at closing opposition. You say that he did an irrational thing, and the cost it happened because of a personal moral choice he made, which is why he needs to be held accountable. At government, the instinct is that this evil is a natural output of systemic failure. So people don't feel guilt. Harm feels far more impersonal to people. They don't feel responsibility. So if they want to give like stupid examples that you hitting a woman, then you feel like it's the cost of the patriarchy or the fault of the patriarchy on their side. So you think that I hit the woman because patriarchy made me do it on their side of the house, not on our side of the house. Understand the motion, sit down. I think at that point in time, you have passive complicity. So you obey unjustified rules. You delay things like resistance because of the fact that you don't think you are accountable or responsible in that context. I think this is especially dangerous in like authoritative states or bureaucracies. Why? Because low-level officers that enforce things like deportation orders, the IRGC in Iran, for example, on their side of the house, tells themselves that I'm not evil, that's just how the system works. So oppression continues, and civil disobedience is something that does not happen on their side of the house. So you have a greater tolerance for oppression. You have a greater tolerance for the state to oppress you. Let's weigh this. This is one step prior to any of government arguments on change. Because if people don't think they have the courage or responsibility to bring change, they will not do it. But secondly, opening government's case is that the system is far too powerful. In this particular context, you don't have accountability at proposition because you don't know who to hold accountable. You hold the system accountable. You hold the bureaucracy accountable. We hold individuals accountable, which means change becomes a lot more measurable. You had your chance. Sit down. Second extension. This distorts how we interact with systemic accountability. We think society to respond to atrocity needs to distinguish between three kinds of people. Number one, the architects of harm. So this talks about people like Hitler who directly make those policies, do the Holocaust. Second, passive enablers. So the people I talked about in the first argument, the people who, for example, enact those policies, stuff like that. But thirdly, people who perpetuate that harm. So for example, think about the clergy perpetuated a lot of harmful discriminatory policies in the United States of America in the 19th century. To have accountability, you need to distinguish these people. If evil is banal, everyone becomes equal because everyone is ordinary, everyone is thoughtless, and everyone is unexceptional. If evil is framed as a product of the bureaucracy or a flaw of the human psyche, then you cannot have criminal accountability or condemning people because society says no one is really responsible. The structure, this abstract structure is what we need to hold accountable, which governments agree is really fucking abstract. So what are you holding accountable then? On our side of the house, you have an urgency to solve the problem. Why? Because you think that there is a person who did this, the harm is measurable, and this is the person we need to hold accountable. On their side, there is no urgency to solve this. So when you have a genocide, on our side you say, these acts were chosen by a person and must never be repeated. On their side you say, this is what humans do under pressure. So for all those reasons, like I don't even know, like Hassan Butt doesn't need to speak, he can go home and come back for the final. Clear off bench.
I'll be starting my speech. 3, 2, and 1.
The problem with both opposition benches is simple. They're like, hey, evil can only be limited to a certain number of people who have a certain level of authority, and everyone else is just perfectly fine. So what's their mechanism? Just ask people, hey, just don't be evil. I mean, that literally does not work. That has never worked. The reason for that is simple. How do people work? How does human nature work? Human nature is built on incentives and disincentives. Now, if Ashir comes pleading to me and says, hey, please don't be evil, please don't be evil, but I'm benefiting off of that system, I really don't see any to change. Because notice, a thief will continue to steal unless you hold him accountable for that. So insofar as that is the case, we feel that their counterfactual never really mechanizes to anything, and so the harms that they continue to portray will continue to exist on their side of the house. We never really know how they're able to benefit society. But then 5 things within this debate. Firstly, what essentially evil looks like. Now, according to opposition, evil is essentially what we perceive as the worst of the worst. 2 things to talk about over here. Firstly, who decides evil within the first place? We feel that evil isn't inherently decided by what's massively bad. It's decided by who's in control and has the ability to disseminate information. Now what does that look like? That looks like your authoritarian regime that essentially controls the media, that could be demonizing a minority within your country and blame them. That's literally how the Nazis did with the Jews, where they portrayed themselves as victims and inherently justified an entire Holocaust based on that. And insofar as that is the case, we feel that evil ends up becoming subjective when it is left into the hands of a few. Now, where's the comparative over here? We feel on government, what you're able to do is that you're able to establish evil as something objectively bad. What does objectively bad look like? We feel these are things that come to you from your primary and secondary socialization and go on. Like, for example, you have a universal idea that stealing is bad, beating up people is bad. And insofar as that is the case, we feel that evil inherently encompasses these things, and we feel that opposition then ends up debating a rather unholistic approach, where they're only taking things to the extreme. But then secondly, even if you extend the definition, what happens then? We feel you're still able to get unique benefits. 2 things. Firstly, we feel people are called out for what they do. People are called out for their actions. And secondly, understand this breaks echo chambers. So for instance, a person who is inherently never taught that stealing is bad can never really see something evil in that. But insofar as you're able to villainize that term, you're able to say that, hey, stealing is a massive issue because it's evil. We feel that these are people that are inherently able to break out of these echo chambers within the first place, and that's how you're able to create a society that inherently moves away from these negative notions that exist. What's the way up over here? We feel on our side of the world, when these people are inherently called out for their actions, when these people are essentially aware of what's objectively bad and are avoiding that, we feel people develop a morally good conscience, where people are like, hey, we're not going to indulge in anything that has a slight notion of being evil, because evil is inherently a villainized thing. On the other hand, we feel on their side, evil continues to be something subjective and something something inherently unattainable. So me as an ordinary citizen can never be evil, but on the other hand, someone like Asim Munir is the only one who is evil, and that is something inherently 0.0001% of the population can achieve. So on their side of the world, evil continues to be subjective, and evil never really manifests into anything. On that note, towards the second idea then, about ideological bubbles. 3 things to talk about over here. Firstly, we feel that this argument inherently is unfair within its nature, because we feel general ideologies aren't inherently where the problem lies. The problem lies where things become distasteful. Distasteful things look like casual misogyny. Distasteful things look like racism. And we feel these are the ideas that we at government are tackling, not inherently moderate differences between your right and left. We feel these are things that can continue to exist irrespective, because these aren't things that are demonized. These aren't things that are objectively bad within the first place. But secondly, understand this entire idea is also inexclusive. We feel that polarization is something we find within the status quo. We feel that echo chambers do exist within the status quo. But how are we then inherently unique within this idea? We feel you're able to isolate hatefulness from marginal ideological differences, because hatefulness is something that is perceived as something very bad, that is something that's villainized. And insofar as that is the case, we feel that we're uniquely good, because A, you're able to isolate hatefulness, but B, you stop an avenue of sympathy where people never really manifest an idea that, hey, something like racism can be justified within the first place. And if anything, we feel that these distasteful ideas, these ideologies inherently do end up stopping within the first place. And insofar as that is the case, we feel that this idea about ideological bubbles really does not exist. Third idea then regarding victim dehumanization. Two things over here. Firstly, we feel this idea inherently exists more so on opposition's world. We gave you entire analysis on how microaggressions exist, how you constantly demonize minorities for your own personal gain. And insofar as that is the case, we feel that this idea about someone facing racism, a Baloch person facing racism, for instance, in Punjabi land, isn't inherently going to ever find that accountability. If he speaks up, the majority is only going to suppress that idea, because notice, what are these people then seen as? You can inherently perceive them as terrorists, you can show them as evil, when in reality we feel that is not how it should work. And insofar as that is the case, we feel what you end up doing is you make accountability flexible. So a person who faces racism on their side of the world can never really actually get accountability for that in the first place. Institutions can end up being evil on their side of the world. We feel on opposition, on
last chance.
We feel on government, you really never get that, because we feel that institutions can be seen as evil too. But notice how you have a set criteria on what accountability looks like. So insofar as that is the case, we feel in the long run you're able to at least get altruism on our side, where people perceive certain things as bad and other things as fine. But on their side of good, these victims continue to get dehumanized because racism is okay, because accountability is completely flexible. Ideas we talked about never really engaged on their side. Fourth thing then, where they talk about blaming institutions, to something we got from closing. Two ideas over here. Firstly, understand if I enter ICE, that is informed consent. Nobody put me on gunpoint to enter ICE. So inherently, if I'm doing something evil, that is deporting people unfairly, that is a consequence of my own action. Nobody really forced me to do that in the first place. But secondly, understand on our side of good, the individual and the institution both can get blamed, because your idea of evil is inherently perceived as something that is attainable, not something that is limited to a few things. Insofar as that is the case, we feel that individual who indulges in evil can be held accountable, but second, the institution itself can be held accountable. So on our side of the road, you at least have moral weighing of actions, where people inherently look at the consequences of their actions before they take any action. On all of those notes, closing government.
Starting, sorry. The comparative is simple. Is evil done because of a purpose, or is evil done because you don't know actually that it is evil? That is the thing. This debate is not about whether evil is actually in this. This debate is about the narrative that spreads within society. Because if you think that Hitler, went through or perhaps studied from LUMS, had perhaps indoctrination of good things, etc., would not have done them. Those things. That does not take away from the fact that he did those things. This debate is actually about accountability on those individuals. And this is Daniyal's case as well. Because if you think that people have this individual capacity to be better, you hold them morally absorbable of those actions. You defocus upon the actions committed and focus upon what they could be. This means that it dehumanizes those individuals, that causes great evil. This is not about Muhammad Ali's interpersonal relationships and the crimes or little evils that he commits with these crimes. This debate is about great evil. Hitler committing those crimes. Taliban thinking that those individuals that were killed in 9/11 and all those troubles was justified. Sit down, I'll take you in the 5th minute. Was justified. The accountability of these people. The people happens only in our side of the house. Insofar as you hold them dehuman because they commit dehumanized acts in nature. Because Taliban killing those people at the shoot of a gun, because they think that heaven is on the other side of that white child that is killed is important. This was Daniyal's case, that they misconstrue what happens in their side of the house. What happens in their side of the house is that you think that, oh, these people have been indoctrinated, that they can be better. This is not really the case, is it? Because you hold structures accountable. You think that happens, but they don't tell you why that reflection happens at the individual level. They say, oh, you're going to think about that. That reflection does not happen because you have an excuse. What is that excuse? That external structure. That external structure that you can say that I did not commit those crimes. This is like Askari, you're not writing. That does not happen in this area. Because you can say to those individuals, you are not bad. If you hit that woman, yes, we can forgive you. If you hit that individual, yeah, if you were racist, we can forgive you. We can forgive you because we want to hold that structure. But that is not really true or possible, is it? Because yes, that individual did that perhaps best case scenario, because out of a sheer ignorance. But that victim that exists does not care about the sheer ignorance that exists. But secondly, I think this is really important in terms of social justice movement, because social justice movements need to have a quantifiable evil, need to have a quantifiable evil that they go towards. In their side of the house, there is this reconciliation of evil that happens. There is this active humanization happens. In so far, they say that morality becomes subjective in the sense that other aspects can exist. This is case-changing framing that they miss out because they don't necessarily know the case. Nuremberg trials.
Take one.
Nuremberg, yeah. Well.
Their problem is they said that if you are thoughtless individual, you will still blame the structures. But your comparative is blaming the structures. How is that excuse not symmetric on your side?
No. Our comparative is because you think you're not an thoughtless individual. This debate is not about that. This debate is about people. Yeah, stop करो मैं 3:15 पे बैठते हैं और थोड़ा easy हो जाए, ठीक है? 3:30 पे या 3:25 पे मेरा stop है. मैं 10-15 सेकंड ऊपर लूँगा. Okay. This debate is not about whether those people were actually thoughtless or not. This debate is if you think they were thoughtless, if you think Hitler was thoughtless, if you think that was thoughtless. This debate is about that. This debate is about accountability at its finest. That only happens when you say, yes, that war general did those crimes. That war general should be did that genocide in Yugoslavia, in Nazi Germany, and should be accountable. Their only argument was because Hannah Arendt was a neoliberal Western apologist that failed to see why Germany and in mass voted in Hitler. They voted in Hitler in mass because those people that looked at those actions. When Taliban looked at those actions, when they know they were killing Jews, they killed Jews despite of the fact that the new killing was bad. They killed them because there was this higher sense of righteousness inside of them. This we oppose it. Accountability is the case. Social justice movement have this quantifiability, Nazi Germany, etc. On quantifiability, and they also on this. There are some ideologies, there are some structures. But what are structures without people? What is patriarchy without men? What is Nazism without fascism or its constituents? What is racism without the KKK, etc.? This means that in any era, and this is Daniyal's case, in any era, ideology and structures are purported by some individuals, coalesced individuals, leaders of that ideology. And so far, we in our side of the house, you hold those individuals and you don't pause it and say that look, these people that are doing in mass things, etc. They did it because they were dumb, they were perhaps from Balochistan, did not study at good schools, etc. You hold those individuals at the higher up accountable. This is the shifting. This debate is not about them. But secondly, in this side of the house, what happens as well? Thoughtless individuals committing crime, etc. I'm a wife beater. But the thing is that what happens is that there is the shifting of accountability because you don't want to see yourself as thoughtless. There is this aspect of ego that they fail to preempt within their speeches in that. Yeah, why not?
If you think that thoughtlessness is a problem and you cannot reflect, what is the metric of change on your side? Please tell me, I'm so curious.
No. The metric of change isn't that thoughtless people are going to suddenly become thinking people. There is no metric of change in towards how thoughtless people become thinking individuals in your side of the house. Perhaps it could be education, etc. You don't tell that, can't be credited. But what are we as society, and what is Daniyal's in our case, is that it matters more what is accountability and matters what happens in that. Who you hold accountable, who you dehumanize. Because these are acts of great evil committed by people that think other people are dehumanized. You dehumanize those individuals as well because they are not worthy of humanity. You want to hold them accountable. This debate is about that. Change happens, etc. That is very, very vague, abstract, not built throughout all of their speeches. You can't credit on them. But we also have metrics of change. Quantifiability. You know people who to hold accountable. You know people who are going to die. Internal self-accountability does not work because we build the case of ego. Internal self-accountability does not work because we tell you that escape always shifts lower. What does work is that you're thinking that other people are accountable, that Hitler did kill those people, that he knew that killing was an immoral act, that when the Osama bin Laden shot those two planes into the Twin Towers, he knew that those Twin Towers people were going to die. And this is the narrative of what is evil within society that matters. Top up. Last comparative. Last thing. 10-15 seconds I said. Last comparative. in any side of the house, thoughtless people are not going to be held accountable. But it matters where evil coalesces. Our side is the only side that proves you the accountability of evil coalesces to the top up. Those war generals get held accountable. Make the final easy. Fourth, second, first.
Fourth, second, first.
Guys, take your